Hello and welcome to week 4 of Atheism for Lent. I'm feeling a lot more enthused, I think because, I hate to say it, but weeks 1 and 2 are fine, but it's when I get into week 3 that my energy comes to life. And now week 4, these are some thinkers who have definitely had a big impact in my, sorry, I'm just getting rid of myself. I can see myself in the corner. They've had a very big impact in terms of my thinking. And so, again, my job is just to introduce some of the stuff that you're going to encounter this week and try to link these thinkers together. In a way, that was easier in the previous weeks, even though the thinkers that we looked at in previous weeks, they're all very thoughtful and unique in their own ways. But, when you look at the mystics, you can kind of broadly see that most people you looked at last week were saying something similar about this idea of, to use the philosophical jargon, intuition saturating intention. This saturation of kind of this being short-circuited by something that is grander than we can imagine. And from that, you get the idea that when we speak of God, we speak of less than God. And the last thing you had last week was a famous sermon by Meister Eckhart that has that beautiful line, "I pray, therefore, God, rid me of God." Now, I don't want to simplify what that means, but I would kind of go like, if you think about that approach, you enter into a space where religion and God talk never reaches what it sometimes purports to reach. The signifiers, like the signifier God, never signifies the reality of the absolute that is beyond all concepts. So you start to get the idea that religion at its best is a theopoetics. Religion is something other than a discourse that connects us with the absolute. Now, this can be seen in various religious traditions and denominations. And in fact, just as an aside, I used to live beside some social influencers. Now, in LA, everybody's a social influencer. So when I was living in an apartment block, honestly, it felt like half the people who lived in the apartments were social influencers. But it's not like that in Ireland. But obviously, it's increasing. So there are some young people now who make a living through being kind of influencers on TikTok and Instagram. Anyway, I used to live beside a couple of them, and they would have parties. These were young kids in their early 20s, and they were having big parties, living large. But about 6 months ago, I saw a TikTok of one of the guys who I really like. He's a really nice guy called Jed, and he just watched that movie about the Jesus freaks. I can't remember what the movie was called, but it came out, maybe it was, to be honest, might have been a couple of years ago now it came out, and it was about that 1960s, 1970s time where a lot of the kind of LSD acid heads became religious. And it was kind of, I guess, the start of the Vineyard movement. Anyway, there was a movie about that. I never saw it, but this guy saw it, and he did a post about it, and I could tell that he was really impacted. And I was like, he's going to become born again. Probably, because that's what happens in Northern Ireland. We call it becoming born again. I'm sure that's the same in America, but it's a particular type of, evangelicalism, baptized in the Holy Spirit or whatever. Anyway, it did happen. It happened a couple of weeks ago, and he's talking all about it. And I saw him in the lift the other day, and first thing he talked about was being born again. It happened 2 weeks ago, filled with the Holy Spirit. And we were in the lift, and he was talking about it in this lift with other strangers. And I was like, oh yeah, I remember this. But he said, I'm not into religion. All that religion stuff is, just corrupt and bad. But I'm into the relationship with Jesus and spirituality. And, in his own way, that was the whole spiritual but not religious thing. And you can see that in a much more sophisticated way with the mystics, there is a certain idea that there is, let's call it, a spiritual encounter with something that religion cannot capture. So whenever someone says, I'm spiritual but not religious, often what that means, and not always, but often, because that's a term that's used a lot, I think, by people today. And often what that means is that they have an encounter and a type of relationship with an absolute that cannot be captured in religious traditions, religious dogmas. Right. Now, I outline that because this week kind of embraces that idea, right? Goes like, okay, the mystics are interested in the spiritual encounter with this absolute, and religion is this almost like excremental remainder. It's this kind of like fragmented, almost trash-like, or I say like excrement that comes out of this spiritual encounter. But what the people who, and these people only represent a huge number of people. I could have done, filled a month of different thinkers that I love who are doing something similar to the ones you'll encounter this week. But the ones that you're going to encounter, they go, okay, let's go with that. But we're interested in the excremental remainder. We're interested in what you put in the trash. Right? And Feuerbach is the first person you're going to see here, and I'm probably going to spend most of this time talking about him. But they're like, okay, let's imagine that you can have some relationship with the absolute, and maybe a few people have that, or maybe a lot of people have that. But they're in different ways interested in going, no, but what religion is what people do with it. What's interesting is, what do people mean when they talk about God? What are people doing when they do religion? And this is the beginning of, you could say, phenomenology. And a phenomenological question doesn't go whenever you're talking about God, what is God, who is God? A phenomenological question says, what am I talking about when I talk about God? What am I doing when I do this God talk, when I do religion? And so this group are atheists, not in the sense of week 2 where they're rejecting a metaphysical reality. And most of these people, I think all of them, would do that, right? But that's not what they're interested in. They're atheists in that they are not interested in theism. They're not interested in the question of some beyond. What they're interested in is, what are you talking about when you're talking about God? What is this thing called religion? And this is incredibly rich, right? So some of the thinkers you're going to encounter this week, unlike the kind of more new atheist thing, which really doesn't have that much depth, and it hasn't influenced things in terms of various disciplines in very deep ways, right? A lot of the thinkers you're encountering this week have influenced the world in profound ways and continue to open up avenues of thought that remain deeply profound, deeply insightful, because they're talking about the bits that is most important, right? So I'll maybe just get into this by talking about Feuerbach. So Feuerbach comes after Hegel, and Feuerbach, really interesting figure. I've always enjoyed Feuerbach, great writer. He's a philosopher, and he was a really insightful philosopher, but he was incredibly well read in theology as well, and he was an expert in Luther, and he really understood not just the philosophical tradition, but the theological tradition. And he talks about this actually, and I think it's the essence of Christianity, that, again, it's like, okay, there's that mystical stuff, that's fine, but actually, religion is what people who say they're religious do. Let's look at that. Let's look at that bit. There's something really interesting going on. And he said, this is the most fascinating thing. And what he argued, which is, again, interestingly similar to the mystics in some respects, is he said, when we talk about God, we're talking about ourselves. Religion is a way of encountering something about ourselves in a disavowed or repressed way. And again, that's not dissimilar from when Meister Eckhart says, I pray, therefore, God rid me of God. Because Eckhart is saying that because he knows that when we speak about God, we speak of less than God. But what Eckhart wasn't saying there was, oh, well, then what are we saying? And this is what Feuerbach comes out and does. He says, because what we're doing is we're doing a discourse about humans. So he famously said, theology is anthropology. Now, Feuerbach called himself a friend of the theologians. He saw himself as somebody who wanted to see theology accomplish its mission. He saw himself as a friend of the theologians, a friend of the religious, and he thought that theology and religion, when it went to its zenith, when it got to its most mature form, it deconstructed itself. It disappeared. And the way he thought about this, and this is an incredibly important idea that has developed subsequently into psychoanalysis, is the idea of projection. So for Feuerbach, in order to become self-conscious, right? So you can be conscious, an animal can be conscious, in other words, it's experiencing the environment around it and it's reacting to that environment. But to become self-conscious is to become conscious of your consciousness, right? To become conscious means to self-reflect. And what Feuerbach understood is that in order to begin to self-reflect, we need something that reflects us back to ourselves, right? So the only way you come to know yourself is first of all by seeing yourself in a mirror, in a reflection. Now, I say this develops into Freud and into Lacan and beyond, the notion, what Lacan calls the mirror phase, that the first time an infant encounters and begins to think of themselves as a thing, it's reflected through someone else's eyes. So you'll notice kids often talk about themselves as an object. They'll maybe count themselves when they go, how many brothers and sisters do I have? And they'll count themselves as an object, not as a subject. I can't think of an example. I've got it on the tip of my tongue. If anybody can think of how that looks if you've got kids. I don't have kids, but you'll notice that the kid at first experiences themselves as an object in the other's eyes. That's often why a child might be terrified of the lights going out, of the parent not being in the room, because in a sense they get their sense of self through being seen as a self through the eyes of the other. And then through the mirror, which is, for example, the mother says to a little boy, "You're just like your brother. Oh, you're big and you're strong," right? So again, the infant is beginning to see themselves through the mirror of the brother. And what you do is you put these qualities into the other and you begin to get a sense of self, right? That's very crude understanding of projection, but it's also very important because I think we all understand how projection works to some extent, that we find ourselves in the things that we are looking at, that we think we're looking at objectively. I just did a podcast with Elliot and we talked about this, that even with political issues, there's a whole pile of things that you might be concerned about. It might be environmental issues, it might be animal rights, it might be some conflict that's happening in the world, it might be economic issues. These are problems that are in the world and we look at them. But we don't just look at them. There's something of ourselves in the causes that evoke something out of us. This is what Lacan called the gaze. So we look at something objectively, but the gaze is when we see something of ourselves and our desire in what we're looking at. So for example, you might be concerned about environmental issues. You might not just be concerned, you might be terrified. You might feel that the world is very unstable, that you are contributing to that, and also authority figures, governments and corporations are contributing to that, and that we're potentially going to end in some sort of catastrophe. just making sure there's a message from Atheism for Lent. I'm making sure this is still recording. Yeah, we're good. That's good. Oh, sorry, where was I? Oh, yes. So you've got those concerns. Now, if those concerns are overwhelming, like overwhelming to the point that you can't get on with your life, you can't go to sleep at night, you're genuinely terrified, it gives you suicidal thoughts, etc., then what you may discover is that in that analysis of the world, there's something of how you felt maybe within your family. Maybe you felt your family was very unstable, that it was about to end in catastrophe, and that you had some responsibility in that, and also the authority figures had responsibility in that. And what at first you don't see, because we don't see this as the unknown face, right? We think we're just interested in a cause because it's a cause. But often, or always, what you find is the causes that appeal to you, you're within them. There's some extent to which some part of yourself is objectified in the cause that you are experiencing. And part of what one needs to do is realize that you are in the thing that you think you're objectively looking at. Now, the result of that is not that you'll no longer care about environmental issues, but actually the result might be you can have more distance and think about it more creatively and be less anxious and therefore more effective. But a lot of it is, at first you don't see yourself in the thing that is out there, and then very gradually you come to see something of yourself in what you're looking at. So that's projection, right? Now Feuerbach gets this, but he's not talking about projection on an individual level. He is talking about that for humanity to come to know itself, it first needs to project its essence onto something, see itself externally, objectively in the outside world, and then eventually realize that's us, that's our spirit, that's the essence of humanity, and then take that back into ourselves. And so Feuerbach brilliantly, very, very brilliantly in his books, The Essence of Christianity and The Essence of Religion, he shows that what we deposit in the bank that is God can describe not what we are as individuals, but what we as a species are capable of. The justice, the love, the development of society. Even, you could even think that the promises of religion in terms of a world of peace and everlasting life are things that we as a species can actually accomplish. And, maybe, and it's Feuerbach saying this hundreds of years ago, we can see how potentially as humanity continues to evolve, we may end up creating the technologies that at one point were magic or seen as religious, but actually we go, no, these are within our grasp to do. And Feuerbach saw then that theology and religion is absolutely necessary. It has to put out the essence of what we are as a species. That has to come to maturity. And then we have to see that is our unknown face. So God is a screen. And Feuerbach, he also argues, has a good argument for why we create the screen called God, which I think I might have in the supplemental reading. Doesn't matter if I don't. That's interesting. But he says basically we have to create a screen, and then we need to project onto that screen our essence and then take it back. So that's kind of Feuerbach in a nutshell. So he's taking, as I say, the trash, the bit that you think's rubbish, the bit that you thought wasn't good. No, that's amazing. In fact, that's what's going to help us as a species become greater, to become more prosperous, to bring democracy to more people, to kind of bring emancipation and freedom to everyone. This utopic vision of heaven and this notion of God as wanting the best for us is what we can do. Now, on that, every thinker that you're looking at this week has a similar view in the sense that they're all interested in human flourishing. All of these thinkers are interested in human flourishing in different ways. And some of them have more positive views on religion than others, but that's their main interest. And Feuerbach really, he's a bridge figure. He's not a major philosophical figure. And I have my disagreements with him, which I think will come up in future weeks. But this notion of projection, incredibly interesting. And probably, I mean, Karl Barth, the theologian, saw Feuerbach as the best way of understanding liberal and progressive Christianity, which I think is probably true. That, there's this idea that God is a reflection of ourselves. As I said, theology is anthropology. Now, after Feuerbach, you hit on Marx, Karl Marx. And Marx basically takes on Feuerbach's position. Marx thinks Feuerbach is basically broadly right. But in the writing that you're going to get, which is called From the Introduction to Hegel's Philosophy of Right, isn't that right? Yeah. Introduction to Hegel's Philosophy of Right, it is very famous, the very famous line, religion is the opiate of the people. So you're going to kind of read this incredible piece that Marx wrote that has one of the most famous lines of Marx, religion is the opiate of the people. Like different philosophers have these famous lines that people know. Like people know Descartes said, I think, therefore I am, even if they've never read any Descartes. So a lot of people know Marx's opiate of the people. But what you'll notice is that Marx doesn't have a negative view of religion as such, right? It's different from Feuerbach. So I'm going to outline why it's different from Feuerbach and kind of give you a sense of what he's doing in this piece. The first thing is an important critique of Feuerbach, where he says, religion doesn't tell us the eternal essence of the human species, which is what Feuerbach thought, right? So what God is and what religion is tells us about the kind of the ahistorical, eternal essence of who we are. Marx said, religion is more like an encyclopedia that tells you about the values of that time, that epoch, that age. It takes the values of a certain age and it makes them sacred, makes them eternal. It kind of gives them a God-given divinity. So, and this is what it is ideology, right? This is ideology. Won't get into the ins and outs of what that means, but one of the things that ideology means is ideology is a way of thinking that renders contingent historical reality into something eternal, right, without cracks. So, in other words, the way we produce and distribute goods and commodities, right, today, right, capitalism, ideology says, well, that is the way it should be. That is the eternal way. That is the correct way. Not simply that's an historical creation, a way, something that's come out of historical and material conditions and that can change for good or for bad, right? But rather ideology renders the historical ahistorical. So Marx starts by going, well, Feuerbach's great, but first of all, it's telling us about the current age, the current values, and it puts them into a kind of eternal form. And then secondly, he says, and religion helps us bear the weight of the suffering of the current system. Right? So one is it kind of reifies the current system, and two is it gives a way for people to bear the weight of that system, to mourn it. And what he means by that is that, say, for example, we're in a system where the people are poor and oppressed and they sacrifice and they don't own what they do. They have to sell their labour on the market, etc., etc. But in the next life, we'll all be equal, and spiritually, we're all equal. And in heaven, the poor will be given riches, etc., etc. So you can be sad by the oppression of the present age, but you can hope and you can pray and you can feel some consolation knowing that very soon you will be in heaven. And what I might add, he's not in this week, but I might put this in as a supplemental, is Joe Hill, who was a famous activist who wrote the song which goes "Pie in the Sky When You Die," which was a play on the Salvation Army song, where in the sweet by and by you'll go to heaven. And Joe Hill wrote this parody that basically kind of showed how the Salvation Army's hymns were a way of making workers feel okay about terrible conditions because they'll have pie in the sky when you die. So that's what kind of Marx brings to the table. Then I'm going to jump on to the next person, day 3, is Simone de Beauvoir. And this is an excerpt from The Second Sex. Now, she doesn't talk about religion very much in The Second Sex, but this is a passage where she does. And I put it in here because it's very Marxist. Right? So Simone de Beauvoir brings in a nice mix of Marx and Jean-Paul Sartre. Right? And in this piece, she does a reading that I think really complements the reading of Marx that you have, where basically she asked the question, why would women give themselves over to religion and devote themselves to this? Because at the very beginning of the reflection, you'll see she says, well, you can kind of see on the surface why men would want to countersign religion, because God basically countersigns them. Like religion and Christianity, she's thinking, and the church traditionally supports men's rules and men's domination. And so she goes like, okay, so you can understand men would like religion, but what about women? And she offers 2 reasons in this reflection. The first, she says that, well, interestingly, she says, men will have a funny relationship to religion because one is it countersigns their desires, right? They get to be in charge. But also it does challenge them because they have to be humble in relation to God. And in religion, the vanity of humanity is laughed at. Good, like the achievements of humanity are nothing in comparison to what we will have in heaven. So there's a certain humility that comes from religion, where she says, but for women, there's a promise that actually everyone is equal, not in the material world, but spiritually we're all equal, and when we get to heaven, we'll all be equal. So there's a sense in which Simone de Beauvoir says religion for women can actually kind of bring them to the level of men in some kind of non-material way. And in fact, because religion can attack pride and the achievements of humanity and all of that, right? There's a way in which she says women can feel a little bit good about their position, that spiritually they're equal, and actually why bother with all of those kind of worldly activities that ultimately don't mean very much. And then she then says as well that women within religion have found ways to get what Freud would call substitute enjoyment. She says women, just like men, have narcissistic desires, masochistic desires, sadistic desires, and not being able to present them in the world, there's ways of expressing those in spiritual ways through religion and get a substitute enjoyment. So Simone de Beauvoir kind of offers a way of trying to understand why does religion persist, and why would women who on the surface are oppressed by religion with these kind of ideas of male headship, why they would want to continue on with expressing the religion. And basically what she's saying is that there's a type of, as I say, substitute enjoyment, and you get a certain wish fulfillment through it in a spiritual way. And she basically thinks, of course, that's a bad thing. Like, she thinks this is why it's very similar to the Marxist reading, because in the Marxist reading there's a beautiful line that says, religion is the imaginary flowers on the chains of our oppression. We must get rid of the imaginary flowers, not so that we see the chains in despair, but so that we can break the chains and pick living flowers. Now, what Marx is saying is 2 things, really. One is that the chains of our oppression, religion makes them look like they're eternal. There's nothing we can do about them in this life, right? That's the way it should be. That's the way God ordained it. And then secondly, it puts imaginary flowers on those chains so that we can bear them a little bit better. And Marx says we have to get rid of the imaginary flowers and realize that we can break the chains. Just like an alcoholic, the first thing you have to do is an intervention, get them off the alcohol, which they're drinking because it's a painkiller, to get rid of maybe some catastrophe in their life, some impotence that they feel. But they get off the alcohol, then they see the chains of their oppression. But you don't do the intervention out of some sadistic impulse. You do it because you know that the first step is kind of getting off the drug, seeing the oppression, and then you can potentially do something about it. And Simone de Beauvoir is saying something similar, which is, yes, you get this substitute enjoyment and this with this wish fulfillment and a way to express your desires in religiously endorsed ways. However, that gets in the way of real emancipation. Right, so there's that continuity. From there, then, I want to jump into Freud. Again, all of these thinkers are saying such interesting things. I'm doing it very quickly. I'm not doing them justice, but Freud comes in. He wrote a number of books on religion. Now, this wasn't his main thing at all. He wrote mostly on other things, but he did write like Totem and Taboo, Moses and Monotheism, and Future of an Illusion are all books on religion. And connected with Simone de Beauvoir here, and where Simone de Beauvoir is kind of bringing together psychoanalysis and Marxism, is that Freud, in this reflection you're going to get, is arguing that one of the reasons for religion's perseverance is because it speaks of something of us. So in a similar way to Feuerbach, who says it speaks of our essence as a species, Freud says that, in psychoanalysis, when you're analysing someone's religion, you're going to find it, again, their unknown face is within that. And that religion has its power because of this wish, because we put our libidinal desires into it. Now, interestingly, he makes a distinction between delusion and illusion. And he says, listen, I'm not arguing about whether religion is a delusion or not. And by delusion, he means completely divorced from reality. A delusion is divorced from reality. He says what religion is it's an illusion. And what an illusion is something we imagine because our desires are within it, because we wish it to be true. And then Freud says, sometimes what you wish to be true can be true. And he uses the example, he says, of a middle-class girl who thinks that she'll marry a prince. He says, well, maybe she will marry a prince. It's still an illusion, i.e. it's a fantasy she's having that is a wish fulfillment that she gets substitute enjoyment from by fantasizing about it, and it's to cover over some lack. But it doesn't mean that it might not happen. So he kind of says like the idea that Jesus will come back is even less likely, but that's not the point. And he says that what religion does is it hooks our libido, it hooks our desires. So if you think about obsessive compulsions that children have, right? Children have to touch the tap a certain amount of times or whatever. And as adults, somebody might have to wash their house before they can leave the house. They have to have certain rituals that they do in order to allay their anxiety. For Freud, those are private religions. Obsessive compulsions are private religions. And then the public religion are similar kind of things. They're obsessive compulsive rituals that help allay certain anxieties that we have and that fulfill certain wishes. Now, this Freudian idea and is important in that what some of these thinkers and people like Nietzsche who were not doing and Schopenhauer who were not doing, but a lot of these thinkers, they provided alternative explanations for why we embrace religion that don't necessarily contradict, right? They're not like, it's not like the new atheists are saying God cannot exist, right? But they're just going, here's an explanation for the religious experience that doesn't require the belief in God. and we're going to set that to one side. Again, that's the type of atheism here. Don't think of it as they're disproving God. They're almost like, this is why I put this in week 4, they're almost kind of agreeing with the mystics, almost, right? They're going, yep, okay, that we're not talking about God. Religion is not talking about some absolute. And then they go, so what's it talking about? Well, it's talking about us. That doesn't interest you. But hey, that's the really interesting stuff. That's the meat of religion. That's what people, it's what people do on a Sunday and during the week, and what people read. That's the interesting thing, and it's telling us something about ourselves, our unknown face. Now, from there, we jump to I'll say just very quickly something about Jean-Paul Sartre, and then Emma Goldman. So from Freud, the next day you're going to have Jean-Paul Sartre. And it's an excerpt, and I have the whole essay. I would recommend you actually read the whole essay, but I did a shortened, abridged version if you don't have the time. And it's called Existentialism as a Humanism, and it's a great piece if you want to get a basic idea of Jean-Paul Sartre's philosophy. It's a great piece. But in this, he basically argues for this idea of radical freedom, and this idea that whatever you believe, you have to take responsibility for it. That if you, and he uses the example of someone who has an ethical choice. It's during the Second World War, they're in France. They can either go over to Britain and join the resistance movement and fight the Nazis and the German army, or he can stay with his aging mother who's already lost a son in the war. So he's her only son, and she's ill. So he can stay with his mother and make a massive difference, but like a small difference worldwide, but a massive difference to one person, or can join the resistance and make a very small difference, but in something world historical, right? So that's the decision this kid has to make. And he goes to Sartre for an answer. And what Sartre says is that, what the kid wants is an answer, wants some authority to say what he should do. He doesn't want, as we can appreciate, doesn't want to have to make that decision himself, right? Once the tea leaves to tell him, or the professor, or maybe a religion to tell him. And what Sartre says is you can't avoid having to take responsibility for that decision yourself. And even going to see Sartre to ask his advice is telling you something about what you want to hear. Because if you go to a friend for advice, you already probably know what they're going to say, right? If they're your friend, you know the type of thing they'll say. So you're going to them because you want to hear a certain piece of advice, but you want them to say it. So you can avoid taking responsibility yourself. And Sartre says that you cannot escape this radical freedom. So even if you believe in God, you think that God is speaking to you. So you hear a voice and you say, that's God. You have to decide whether that's God or whether that's just a voice in your head or the devil, right? You have to there's no escape from having to take responsibility for your beliefs, whatever they are. And if you try to do this, you try to avoid taking responsibility, he calls this bad faith. Bad faith is where you have these desires, you have these wants, you have to make these decisions, but you try to pretend that someone else can give you the answer. You try to abdicate your responsibility. And so I included this writing because in some respects I think Sartre gives a very interesting, this is why Pascal's a proto-existentialist, this idea that life is a wager that we have to take responsibility for. And his critique of religion, but not just religion, is that it can often be an act of bad faith, an inability for us to decide to act without knowing what we should do. So I wanted to kind of finish, and not quite finish, we got Goldman after this, but near the end to bring out this idea of almost like what a secular religion might look like, a religion of existentialism, right? And Sartre really borrows this from Kierkegaard. So this existentialism comes from a religious place, but he kind of secularizes it, and in a very interesting way. And then finally, Emma Goldman. Emma Goldman was this activist, anarchist, fascinating figure who writes beautifully and very aggressively. She wrote this essay on religion, and she doesn't fit that neatly in some respects with the story I've told, because her views are very more like Jean Meslier. There's a Meslier type vibe to this. She just goes for it in terms of Christianity being a slave religion, a religion that robs us of our emancipatory potential, that is just a weapon to be used by the powerful against the powerless. And so there is an element of the critiques that you've seen where religion is ideological, i.e. it kind of is a justification of a present age, but she goes for this in a very aggressive way. So I thought I would end with this very powerful essay that she wrote, just basically arguing that Christianity is against human flourishing. It's about keeping people downtrodden, and that this thing, because what she's really annoyed about is that she says that some of her colleagues kind of go, oh, yes, but there's this beautiful dimension of Christianity and there's the beautiful words of Jesus and all of this. And she wants to go, no, you're trying to throw the baby out or throw the bathwater out and keep the baby, but they're actually intertwined. You can't do that. You think there's some purity that's away from the dirt, but she says, no, this slave mentality is within the very core of Christianity. It is against human flourishing. So there you go. That is a lot that you're going to get this week. I think it's a great week. In fact, I think it's better than last week. I think it's very disturbing in the best possible sense. Very rich veins to look at. And again, if I wanted to say what unifies all of these, it's one, that they are interested in being religious but not spiritual, i.e. they're going, that the religion's where all the meat is. And two, they're interested in human flourishing and coming to an understanding of human emancipation and liberation. And they're looking at religion through the lens of emancipation. And then finally, thirdly, I'd say their atheism is not the rejection of a metaphysics like week 2. Their atheism is an indifference to those questions of some absolute reality. Because they say when you speak about God, you're always speaking about yourself, whether it's as a species or whether it's of the present age or whether it's you as an individual. There's something about religious language which is a mirror that reflects something of ourselves.